All right, we've talked through the 10 concepts. I spent some time giving examples on them. Now I'm going to show you what the document looks like since we've talked through those concepts, and we can discuss the areas that I was mentioning that were important and what it looks like in an outline type of form. Let's look at it. Okay, so this is the outline of the SOP that we were working on together in the beginning half of the video. And you'll notice here that the objective is talking about communicating with the client to ensure that we provide updates proactively. Then I went on to identify the stakeholders that are involved, and the managing attorneys here, and one paralegal is also here too. When it comes to understanding the CRM features, I spent some time here talking about what the features would be strictly to get the SOP to implementation inside of the CRM. So I'm focusing on the features that basically really come to mind when it comes to communicating effectively, and that's going to be the client portal, any messaging functionalities inside of the CRM, as well as the email integration. And because I mentioned that I would be focusing on email integration, I took some time to put some more notes here in regards to what that would look like in terms of communication with the client. Then we have the client segmentation by services required, and you'll see that I've listed out all of the milestones that we spent some time talking about in the beginning portion of the video, and also of them are here. I took out the statement of use sub-step that would fall in line if there is a intent to use application being filed, because I wanted to keep this video simple. But in terms of communication channels, I've outlined the three main communication channels that typically will come into play when it comes to communicating with the client for a trademark application type of service. And email, video conferences, and phone are those three communication channels. When it comes to the response time guidelines, I referenced, that when you have a team, we can guarantee that we'll respond to the client within 24 hours, depending on what it is. And you'll see in the SOP that comes from this outline is a lot more detailed in terms of what the communication level will be like and the response time and things like that. When it comes to communication templates, I've outlined every single communication template that would be essential when it comes to a trademark application, and all the templates that should be created. So there's a few of them here, and we'll cover some of them, not all. We'll cover some of those communication templates in the CRM implementation phase that's to follow. Now, when it comes to documenting client interactions, I've also listed that here and provided some information as well based on what we talked about in the beginning portion of the video. And confidentiality and compliance is also referenced here with an emphasis on confidentiality for sure. And then we have the feedback mechanism outlined here as well. And now that I've gone through the outline here, I'm going to go ahead now and walk us through the SOP and spend a little bit more time on that. All right. So here we are looking at the standard operating procedure that it was derived from the outline that I just showed you. And you'll notice that the SOP references the same objective, a little bit more tightened up, and it just says to ensure proactive communication with clients that improves client satisfaction and maintains professionalism. Now, what's in this SOP that's not in the outline that we just went over is the scope and the procedure, right? So the scope is to ensure that this applies to everyone, and specifically talking about trademark applications, and the procedure really goes in and lists different things. One thing to note, and you may want to also do this too, depending on the practice area, of course, that you're supporting, you'll probably want to make sure that you have some kind of reference to the turnaround time, so that way they know that, the turnaround time in certain areas are specific to the client doing their part. So if for whatever reason a particular procedure within the SOP references a turnaround time, and that may be contingent on hearing back from the client, definitely put it in there so that the person that's reading this understands that if there is a delay because of the client, that it should not impact their performance metrics. The comprehensive report slash knockout search, and it then goes into talking about the 1 week turnaround time. One thing to note is that every reference to a turnaround time is going to become very important once we get to the CRM piece of it. So identifying all the areas where there's time associated with it, even if this is not a practice area where deadlines are hard set in stone, you still want to have a time frame, right? And so this also allows you to ensure that when you're having your consultations with the client, you're able to identify right out the gate what the time frames for the different touch points will be, so that way they understand that as well. Earlier on in the outline, when I mentioned that it was a 24-hour response time, that's just if the client reaches out for something specific regarding their matter. These time frames are more in line with the actual work that's being done. Again, but if for whatever reason your firm has longer turnaround times, then you would change it to reflect that. So when it comes to the CRM and implementing some of these things, one thing to note is that areas that stresses a specific due date, you have different options, right? So, for example, we're looking at this comprehensive report and knockout search. There's a 1 week turnaround time to produce the report to the client. That's going to be a workflow that you set up so that once the client completes the intake form, it will trigger tasks to be assigned to the person or user or whoever is inside the firm assisting with the files to begin working on crafting that comprehensive report. In this instance, I have it as the paralegal, and the paralegal is going to review the intake form and then conduct the comprehensive report in the uh, trademark system that you use for searches. And from there, the paralegal would then send it to the attorney for review. The task to the attorney is here, and then the task for the paralegal is also here. And there's also additional information to follow up with the attorney again in a certain number of days. All of these things that are referenced here can definitely live as workflows inside of the CRM, so that way the paralegal is not responsible for ensuring that this information is updated, right? The paralegal can take the responsibility and assign the task for themselves as well as for the attorney, or the CRM can be set up with automations and workflows to be able to ensure that based on the trigger of the client completing the intake form, it will then generate the tasks for the necessary and responsible parties to then begin working on that file. You'll see here that I also in reference what happens after the attorney approves it, and what the attorney would need to do to be able to trigger the paralegal to begin working on the next thing. That can also be updated as a workflow inside of the CRM, so that takes that man hours and man time out of physically having to manually do that task. When we get to the area where it's talking about sending out emails to the client, you'll see here that I have it in bold for the paralegal to reference the email templates inside of the Locus automation section. And this just allows for things to be consistent. As I mentioned before, communication templates really come in handy when it comes to these areas, because it speeds up time and also ensures that the language that you want the paralegal or whoever's supporting your firm to use, they're able to actually use that language and not come up with their own. And it keeps everything formal, and it keeps the professionalism high, and also it prohibits a client coming back and saying that someone sent an email and it didn't make sense, or they were having issues, or whatever the case is, because we're utilizing email templates that are approved by you as the managing attorney or owner of the firm. And that will then make sure that every communication is professional and it all looks the same. Once we get into the trademark application preparation phase of it, again, you'll see that there's a turnaround time referenced here. And you'll also see that there are different things that could be possibly used as triggers. So, for example, once the paralegal receives approval from the client concerning the recommendations, the paralegal will then be responsible for preparing the trademark application from there. That can also be worked through as a workflow inside of the CRM as well. When it comes to the other procedures that fall in line, it also then says what tasks need to be assigned, what types of documents, what file types need to be saved, and a lot of little different things to ensure that the paralegal is following the steps that you outline in your SOP. And these steps can also live as a specific task with subtasks inside of the CRM, so that way you're allowing the CRM to work on your behalf. And once you set it up once, unless you have to make revisions to it, it should be fine for them to follow through with that. We then get on to the section that talks about trademark filing, and you'll see that again we have a turnaround time here, and then we also have procedures for the paralegal to follow, and it again references the email templates inside of the CRM. You'll also see that there is a step here once the document's filed to set tasks inside of Locus to check in with the client every 45 days regarding the status of the application. You'll then see that it leads right into the trademark application dormant period, which is that 45-day interval, and it just allows for the paralegal to make sure that she or he is doing their part to help the firm remain proactive in communications to the client. I added this in because in some instances it does come up, in other cases it doesn't, but there is a step where an office action may be issued on that particular trademark application once an examining attorney is assigned. I've carved that in as a SOP so that the paralegal understands what the procedure is whenever that comes into play. And the paralegal or the CRM is responsible for, if it's the paralegal, they're responsible for adding a task to the CRM to have the attorney review the office action. And if it's a automation, which this one may be slightly tricky to do, you would most likely probably need to have some kind of tag in place, a matter tag, to be able to get this to happen, depending on the system that you're using. But essentially, it will be the responsibility of the paralegal or any other staff member you have to assign a task to allow you as the attorney or another attorney within your firm to go ahead and review the office action and assign any next steps that are necessary to the client or to someone within the firm. The last two areas here are straightforward when it comes to procedure. And one of them, as you see here, is a notice of publication confirmation. And this, as you know, if you're supporting trademark, is an area where there's another little waiting period, but it's important to notify the client of this step because it means that their trademark application is further along in the process and they're closer to having that trademark registered. So again, we're utilizing the CRM with the email templates to notify the client of this update in their case. I also put there that the paralegal needs to add an event to the calendar in the CRM so that they can be able to check in on the status of the publication once it's past that 30-day mark. And then finally, the last big piece of the milestone communications revolves around the trademark registration. And once the firm receives the notice of registration, within a week of receiving that, the paralegal needs to log into USPTO and save a copy of the registered certificate to the matter file, and then email the client a copy of the registered certificate as well. I didn't reference it here in this SOP, but this would be another instance where the CRM could work to your advantage, and you can have it through a workflow immediately send that communication depending on the trigger that you select, or you can have the paralegal use the email templates inside of the system and send an email to the client letting them know of the trademark being registered and then sharing that registration certificate. The last piece of this talks about the revisions that are required around the SOP and when these areas should be updated. And I typically say to whoever's responsible for putting this together to ensure that they try to look at what's working once they get feedback from the client. And the feedback would be in the email template that is assigned to the trademark registration piece so that the person could leave a review. And once you get that feedback, you can then make any modifications that you need to ensure that the SOPs are remaining effective in terms of ensuring that client communication is the priority. When we talked about understanding the CRM, we focused on the email integration component of it, and you'll notice that every single step that is here, I've referenced the email templates, and that is one way the email integration comes into play. And then also, you working on those emails, you can make it have a more personal touch so that it doesn't come off as if it's not warm, right? When it comes to the client segmentation, you'll notice that all of these sections underneath the procedure area really all are segmented based on the particular milestone that comes into play. When it comes to the area that talks about communication channels, I'm sure that you might have also noticed that email is the first point of communication. I mentioned that. And then if there's ever an instance where the paralegal or the attorney is unable to get a hold of the client, they're then required to ensure that they make a call to the client, as well as when the email is being sent out to the client. One of the things to ensure is that within the email, and you'll see it's also referenced here in the email, you want to make sure that you're providing a scheduling link, and that will give the client the option of having a video conference or a phone call with the attorney to have their questions answered. And by doing this, we are giving them the flexibility to choose if they want to do a video conference or they just want to have a simple phone call. Response time guidelines is all throughout this SOP. Every single step is outlined with a time frame of when the individuals within the firm are required to complete things by. This is essential because when you're communicating in the consulting piece of it, you're able to reference these turnaround times that you have in your SOP so that the client is on the same page as well as the internal people are on the same page. So when you're onboarding your employees, paralegals, or whoever, you'll then reference the turnaround times to make sure that they can handle supporting the firm in that way. And then from the client side, it puts them on notice and just lets them know what to expect when it comes to communicating with the firm. Communication templates is another thing that's referenced throughout this. As you see, every single step talks about a communication and utilizing a template for that. And client interactions is also going to be documented. Confidentiality is also referenced in here, as well as compliance, right? So you'll notice that in some of the sections, when it comes to the phone calls, I also make sure that I say that, if the client asks any questions that could be viewed as unauthorized practice of law, they're required to schedule an appointment with the attorney instead of the paralegal or any other staff member that's not an attorney answering the question, to avoid the unauthorized practice of law. So we cover compliance in here, and we also cover confidentiality by notating that anyone within the firm is not allowed to disclose the information externally to any third parties. The feedback mechanism is also in place when it comes to the final email that's being sent to the client, because that email is going to include either an intake form for the client to complete a survey giving feedback on their experience, or they will be provided with a Google link or another link to be able to leave a review on the company page. That is going to take care of everything that I wanted to cover when it comes to the standard operating procedure. I hope that you found this helpful. We're now going to move into the CRM implementation piece.